Bene, buongiorno, ben trovati. Oggi abbiamo l'onore di avere con noi l'amico George Friedman, al quale prego di fare un applauso di benvenuto. George è il fondatore e presidente di Geopolitical Futures, il più importante laboratorio di analisi geopolitica americana, ma soprattutto è un mio riferimento quotidiano perché la produzione sua e dei suoi collaboratori è fondamentale per capire quello che accade nel mondo. Ma nella sua produzione c'è una rubrica settimanale che è un po' una preghiera per me, che si chiama Thoughts in and Around Geopolitics, dove si parla di geopolitica ma molto spesso si fa della letteratura, e questo mi fa ancora più amare il modo di esprimersi e di ragionare di George. George ha scritto un libro molto importante, ne ha scritti diversi, ma ne ha scritto uno molto importante un paio di anni fa, che si chiama The Storm Before the Calm, di cui credo fra poco uscirà una nuova edizione, La tempesta prima della calma, che per noi italiani è il rovesciamento di una poesia di Giacomo Leopardi che si chiama invece all'opposto La quiete dopo la tempesta, ma insomma è sempre lo stesso ciclo. In questo libro George, fra l'altro, espone la sua teoria dei cicli come, ce lo dirà lui adesso, come strumento di analisi della storia e della geopolitica americana, e ci offre una prospettiva sul futuro, perché la caratteristica del laboratorio di George è quello di analizzare il presente e il passato per avanzare delle previsioni sul futuro. E io approfitto della sua ultima produzione di ieri per cominciare la nostra conversazione chiedendogli appunto che cosa sono i cicli e perché i cicli servono a capire l'America e il mondo. Grazie ancora, George. George ha prodotto questo lavoro sui cicli americani e in questo lavoro ha prodotto alcune ipotesi sul futuro basate sui cicli. Allora io vorrei chiedere a George che cosa è un ciclo e perché ci serve per capire l'America.
The United States is a very different country from Europe. We're an invented country. 200 years we didn't exist, and we have been in the process of inventing ourselves for a long time. Europe is not one country, and each country came to be in different ways, and each way they came to be in conflict with another country. So Europe is a disorderly place. It's an excellent place, it's very knowledgeable and everything else, but if I were to ask what's going to happen next in Europe, it would be quite a discussion. America is a simpler place. We invented our regime. We invented our people. They came from everywhere. I came from Hungary. My wife came from Australia. And we made ourselves into an entity. We invented what geography means. And we constantly reinvented our technology. We are a nation which processes change and does it in an orderly fashion. Well, to do that in an orderly fashion, there must be a cycle, there must be a system, something there. There can't be order in Europe. There are too many clocks ringing. But in the United States, there's a process, and it takes about 50 years. And it began with the founding, and then Andrew Jackson opening up the West. And 50 years later, there was a civil war, and after the Civil War, There was the rebuilding of America that had to take place. And after that, 50 years later, there was the Great Depression and World War II, and we had to rebuild who we were again. And then there was the 1970s, a time where there was the Arab oil embargo. We had that problem too. It was a time of economic discomfort, a time of racial tension, a tremendous racial tension. And then that went away, and we built Microsoft. What can I say? And now we are in the middle of the next cycle, 50 years later. And it is a time when the United States is powerful, but there are deep rifts over economic life, social life, and everything else. We have, again, the problem of reinventing America. Here come the Mexicans. They want to be there. These are old problems, not terrible ones. But each time we go through this process, two things happen. We have a feeling of desperation that everything is about to fall apart. And we've done that since Washington. And then there's secondly, we emerge more powerful than we were. The president that helped us emerge last time was Ronald Reagan. And he changed the tax code. And the US military invented the microchip. It was the US military. And suddenly we had this entirely new civilization. So now, before that, we had the huge emergence of the automobile as designing us. And before that, electricity transforming the cities. So we are a country that embraces chaos in the sense of embracing the change that takes place always. At the same time, we live in chaos because it is very hard to live with all this. And so I wrote the book primarily to try to explain why it always looks desperate, and it always, for the past 200 years, has worked out, and why it will work out this time. Now, what the technology will be, what the country will look like, what the government will look like, and all of these minor matters, and they are minor in America, that remains to be seen. But I can promise you the next 5-7 years will be painful for Americans, and therefore painful for the world, who waits for the Americans to tell them what is happening, and America doesn't know now.
Grazie George. Tu hai scritto appunto nel tuo ultimo appunto di ieri che in linea di massima gli americani sono contenti dello status quo, potrebbero cambiarlo, ma gli americani si adattano a pensare che gli altri siano pazzi o mascalzoni. In tempi normali questo non sarebbe allarmante, ma appunto l'America sta entrando in un ciclo di tempesta. Molti americani non si rendono conto di questo e non si rendono conto che la loro vita sta per cambiare, più tardi in meglio, ma adesso attraverso anni molto duri. E poi questo approccio al ciclo tu lo svolgi in 6 punti e io vorrei che tu li commentassi e li spiegassi con noi. Il primo punto dice: il senso comune dell'era precedente, cioè dell'era precedente alla tempesta, ci offre una crisi sociale, economica e militare. Il nostro mondo è cambiato e il senso comune a questo punto produce dei problemi. Quindi, diciamo, se ho capito bene, George, in America c'è una mentalità tutto sommato dello status quo e non vi siete ancora accorti, il pubblico americano non si è ancora accorto dei cambiamenti che vi aspettano. E questo può provocare una frizione tra la realtà e la percezione degli americani. È così?
In part. Americans are aware that the United States is in chaos. Just have this discussion with Donald Trump, and you will know it immediately. The point is that the Americans are very uneasy with the status of America because of a range of social issues, gay rights, going both ways, the existence of economic issues, inflation completely out of hand, of foreign policy issues where we are finding ourselves fighting in countries again that we never heard of before. What is this, Ukraine? Okay? So no, the Americans are very aware of it. What they are not aware of is this is the process by which we live. There is the sense that this is now our inevitable state. This is how we will be, and there's no other change, no other chance. So the same thing happened in the 70s after the Vietnam War, and it was said that America was finished as a military power, and other things that came and went. So we're in that position now. So I don't believe the Americans are at all complacent about what is going on. But you also have to remember that a cycle is not a public policy. It is not a government paper of what is going to happen. It is the unintended consequences of a range of forces that bring us out of the situation. It was not a brilliant plan by an American president, say Gerald Ford, that we got out of the 1970s. The important thing to understand is that Americans tend not to panic over the public because they live private lives. They are not really looking to the government to solve things, although they condemn the government for everything. Okay? So they live their lives, as I do, in a house in Texas, and it goes on. So there are three layers. There is one layer in which we live our lives as you do and are not terrified. There's another layer in which we look at the world and say, my God, what is happening to us? What are we doing to each other? And then there's a third layer where the impersonal forces are working themselves out. This is almost Marxist, I know, but unintended by anyone, these forces work themselves out and deliver us to a new place. So Americans are neither despairing, nor do I think that they're ignorant of what's going on. Look at our elections. They understand it. They do not understand how this could possibly work out, and I understand it only because I saw it 5 times before, at least in books.
A questo punto è interessante capire che cosa tiene insieme gli americani, visto che sono, come tu ricordi, così diversi nelle loro origini. Se esiste un cemento americano, qual è in fondo questo cemento? Su che cosa si basa il fatto di vivere insieme e di sentirsi parte della stessa nazione?
What is it?
Well, we are in the same nation because we're there. And we came there because where we were was unbearable. So one of the things that every American has in common is that he or his grandfather came from somewhere, and his motive in coming somewhere was that he couldn't bear where he was. And it worked. And he came here and he has a life. So, again, I compare you with, I'm Hungarian, my wife is Australian. Very hard to get 2 more different people. And we live our lives because we came here. She for adventure, me because I couldn't stand Hungary. My father decided I had to get out of Hungary. And we made a life, and everything was open to us. And I went and got a doctorate, and I started a business, and I lived my life. And that is what binds Americans together. The thing that binds Americans together is what is possible. First, it is possible to come to this place. It is possible to make your own life. It is also possible for you to fail. It's not in anybody's interest but yours. The American dream was never one of peaceful harmony together. We had our Civil War, of course. The American dream was a dream of what I could become, what we could be. And that dream is very much alive, which is why the Mexicans and everybody else are trying to get there. So all of us have bad memories, but not of America, of the place they came from. And all of them have hopes. And when they see opportunities, they try to take them. And they, of course, regard their governments as idiots, because, as we all know, all governments are idiots. This is written. So they say these things. But they live their life through the possibilities that are there. And that's not a melting pot. We're very, very different. But we share in common the certainty of our lives.
Certo, gli americani sognano più o meno lo stesso sogno, però colpisce il fatto che di tanto in tanto gli americani vengono presi da delle crisi di tipo quasi apocalittico, raccontandosi in declino, raccontandosi in una fase appunto di tempesta, e nel ciclo che tu hai descritto, nel ciclo nel quale l'America sta entrando, tu prevedi, cito quello che tu hai scritto, che ci sarà una grande rivolta che porterà al potere un presidente e un congresso che sanno che il vecchio sistema è fallito, ma sono incerti sulla soluzione e quindi porteranno l'illusione del cambiamento. Ecco, questa previsione abbastanza fosca, su quali basi è fondata?
Well, the forecast is, take a look at the 1970s. Terrific economic problems, racial problems, a very difficult period. We came out of it. And the fact that we came out of it in the past gives a comfort. Now, how did we come out of it? The old system that had been in place had been the system that Roosevelt had put in place. And this said the way to solve all problems is to cut taxes on the poor and increase them on the rich. Well, this turned by this time a terrible problem. There was no investment money. If you wanted to start a business, you couldn't. My first house was 19% interest, which for America was very high. Okay? So how did these things get solved? We elected a president, Ronald Reagan, who didn't exactly know what he was going to do, but he had one understanding: he couldn't do what they did before. And as a result, tax codes changed, a range of social dimensions and everything changed. A president governs according to certain truths, and those truths become false, always, after a while. So Roosevelt governed according to a truce, and for 50 years everybody did a truth, and then it no longer worked. And a man came to power, not knowing what he was going to do, no one knowing that this was the solution, and he passed a rule. He would increase taxes on the poor and decrease taxes on the rich. And everybody said, this is outrageous, what kind of insanity? But it created the investment capital to create the tech boom in the United States. We do not assume that presidents are very smart, because we're a democratic society. We know we're not very smart, so we don't expect more from the presidents than from us. But we also know that in our lives, when faced with a problem, we invented a solution, whatever it was that we had to deal with. And we know we did that because we're still here as individuals. And so we elected a man, a very nice man, Ronald Reagan. If you asked him at the time, do you know what you're going to do? He'd answer, yeah. Anything that they didn't do before, that would be what I do. And that was sort of the key of dealing with it. He did not worship the past. And one of the crucial things about American society is not a contempt for the past, but an unwillingness to be bound by the past. And you saw that with Reagan. Now, it's been 50 years since Reagan. I can't believe it, but it is. 50 years since Reagan, and we're now in the same kind of problem we've had before. And that will emerge somebody who has no idea what he's going to do, but he knows he's not going to do what they did before, that it has to change. So it is the ease with which the American system, political and private, accept the idea of obsolescence, accept the idea that what has happened is the result of what we have done in the past, and accept the idea that we have to do something in the future. I think this is one of the founding principles. Now, are we happy during this time? Oh, no. Are we accusing each other of every crime imaginable? Absolutely. You know, we wouldn't be derived from Europe if we didn't do this. But the point that I'm making is there is a logic here. That if you came here and it worked out, you say, it'll work out again. We have to find out how. Not so quietly or pleasantly, but that's what we say.
Bene, veniamo, prima di arrivare all'attualità, una questione molto importante da chiarire fra noi, cioè il sistema americano è stato fondato alla fine del Settecento non per essere una democrazia, infatti la parola democrazia non compare né nella dichiarazione di indipendenza né nella Costituzione, ma per essere una comunità fondata soprattutto sulla libertà degli individui, come ci ha spiegato George. Quando è che l'America è diventata una democrazia e come?
Well, the first time George Washington was elected president, we had become a democracy. The founders wanted to say, look, the public is not competent to, run the country. They are competent to select who should run the country. Because you can't have a republic if the people don't have some role in it. Otherwise, you have an aristocracy. So in this, I would say, what they were saying was, let us be cautious in pursuing the passions of the public. Nevertheless, let's not assume that the wealthy or the well-born or that these have a unique knowledge of what has to be done. To put it more differently, that particular part of the Constitution was incoherent. I don't know what they were talking about. They both didn't want to have a democracy so that the many could create chaos. They didn't trust the self-appointed heroes, so they created a system where the public elected these people. And we've been discussing not too much about whether we're a republic or a democracy, because we understand that whatever we do, it will be chaotic in the end until we work it out. This is understood. This was understood from George Washington, who immediately had an uprising called the Whiskey Rebellion that had to be put down. This had been understood well about this. Government, called a democracy, called a republic, is not orderly and is not meant to be orderly. It is meant to allow the passions of the people or of the rulers to express themselves. So the United States, from the inside, looks disorderly. From the outside, looks disorderly. And I think in the end, the founders would be very happy with it that way.
Probabilmente anche il vantaggio dell'America è che ha una potenza tale da potersi permettere errori che il resto del mondo, altri paesi, non si possono permettere, grazie anche alla sua collocazione geografica tra due oceani e tra due paesi non minacciosi. Questo è il grande privilegio geopolitico degli Stati Uniti. E venendo al mondo intorno all'America, oggi come quasi sempre l'America è preoccupata più di se stessa che del mondo, però ha individuato un avversario, un competitore strategico nella Cina. Perché proprio la Cina?
Well, look at the world as the Eastern Hemisphere, and Eurasia as the historic power. And when we talk of Eurasia, we talk about the European Peninsula, we talk about Central Asia, we talk about China, Japan. What emerges in the 20th century is another center of gravity, North America. The emergence of the United States changed the entire balance. And as you said, we are extremely powerful. Now, where does our power come from? Well, partly because of a very fertile land, partly because of enormous innovative power, and that innovative power is linked to the concept that I put before. That which is must be improved. The idea that nothing that exists, economically, politically, or something, is sufficient. The Europeans, the Chinese, they are constantly at war with each other. It is, to Americans, an amazing thing how many people have died in the 20th century in Eurasia. But it's the case. But we are, as you said, protected by two oceans. We're the only country in the world that can't be attacked by land. Canada would be nice if it could attack us. It won't. Mexico, no. It wants to move here. The United States, it doesn't want to attack us. We can be attacked only from the oceans. And the foundation of American national security is command of the sea. Admiral Mahan, our great theorist, said that. We must control the Pacific. We must control the Atlantic. And if we control these two oceans, then we have what Goethe called an elective affinity. We could come into Eurasia as we needed to and wanted to, but they could not come into us. So we have had the advantage of innovation on a continent that's relatively secure, and we have had the option in most cases of getting into the war. The one case we didn't, Japan. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, we had to go to war, and we had to protect the Pacific. In World War I, we got into World War I because the Germans were defeating the Russians. And Germany would then build a navy, and they would sail it into the Atlantic. And therefore, we went into World War I to be a force to block German power. And it worked. In World War II, we fought two naval wars. One, the Pacific. They gave that to us to fight. But also World War II was about the U.S. relationship to Britain and the British need for help on land and the American insistence that it control the seas. We talk about the idea of a Lend-Lease. Everybody forgets there were two parts to it. The lend was we would give the British some ships. The lease is they would turn over all of their bases in the North Atlantic, on the West Coast, to us. In other words, we fought the war for the seas. Now, when you are in that position, okay, a chaotic Eastern Hemisphere, you are protected by the oceans, and countries in those areas come to you asking for help, and you get more control of the oceans. Okay? You don't have to go to war. Okay? And then you're in a very powerful position. Now, our relationship to China is like the relationship to the EU. We're open to anything so long as it's on our terms. We're very flexible. But we have an ability to bring pressure to bear throughout the Eastern Hemisphere. That means that World War I, World War II, even the Cold War was fought there, not here in the United States. And this is the issue with the Chinese, which you began the question. The Chinese are an exporting power. And their number one exporter partner is the United States. China gets foreign investment, and the number one investor in China is the United States. Now, they may want other things, but this is the way it is. And the Chinese may want Taiwan, and we don't want them to have it. It's not a big thing, but we like it. But we have a tremendous hammerlock on the Chinese. And in fact, next week, the American and Chinese president will be meeting to discuss the hammerlock. The hammerlock means a hold on them. So it frequently appears that there are, from the Chinese, threats to the United States. But when you look very deeply into the Chinese reality, okay, it isn't as it appears. And this gives the United States an advantage on its hands.
A proposito di Taiwan, che si sta sempre più allontanando dalla Cina, per voi è assolutamente fondamentale che la Cina non incorpori Taiwan? E se sì, e se è così fondamentale, l'America sarebbe disposta a fare la guerra alla Cina per Taiwan? Can you understand my question? Or I repeat it. I'll tell you in English. Why is Taiwan that important for you? And if China decides that they had to invade Taiwan, what would be your reaction? Would you be able and willing to fight for an independent Taiwan?
You hear me? Okay. China's nightmare is that the United States will close their East Coast ports. China is an exporting power. It lives on exports. If those ports are closed, then they can't operate. The United States has the ability to close the ports by putting various missiles into position to do so. And therefore, the Chinese have made no move militarily. It's important to look at what China has done, which is nothing. Now, the United States has no desire to do this to the Chinese. But China also can't invade Taiwan. To invade a country, you have to have what's called amphibious craft, ships that go in the sea. The Chinese have 8 amphibious vessels. Maybe they're hiding some, so 10 or 12, doesn't matter. It takes 9 hours for one of those ships to get to Taiwan. In those 9 hours, American satellites will see them. And then the United States has a choice to sink the ships or not. Now, I don't know what we will decide, but neither do the Chinese. Under these circumstances, the best strategy is to make threats without carrying them out. And this strategy the Chinese have followed very well. You will observe that except for the Korean War, the US and China never went to war. In all of this time that China has been rising to a great power, the United States has not carried out military actions against them, and China has not tried to get in, because there's another side. The one thing we're afraid of is the Chinese coming into the Pacific Ocean and doing what the Japanese did, trying to take control. And each side understands that the other side has power, and rational people will therefore say, I don't know what's going to happen, I better not do anything. So what's happened here is that for the past couple of years, we have threatened each other. And the Americans have said, it's terrible, the world is about to end, the Chinese are coming. And nothing happened. Now the meeting comes. The meeting that comes on November 15th is an extremely important meeting. It is the meeting that comes after Xi has been repositioned. And it is at a time when the Chinese urgently need access to the American markets and to capital, and where the U.S. would love to put Russia in a position that China had an understanding with the United States. No particular good intended, but it'd be interesting. So this meeting, which is the G20 meeting that the Russians chose not to come to, is a place where the U.S. and the Chinese will make agreements. Because long before Xi and Biden sit down at the table, their aides have talked it around what is going to be happening. And the Chinese need us. And we need the Chinese, and nobody cares about Taiwan. It's good for the newspapers. So, but the thing we have to understand is we will defend the Pacific Ocean. It is the foundation of our security.
Yes, but where? In Taiwan, in Guam, or elsewhere?
I did not know we were going to land in Normandy at the time. The war turned out that Normandy was a good place to land in. So where it's going to be is less important than each side understand that the risks of war are greater than the benefits. And both sides really understand that. The U.S. could have crippled the Chinese by blocking the ports. The Chinese could send missiles toward Guam. All sorts of things could be done. The important thing about the U.S.-Chinese relationship is that nothing happened. Just talk. Now, Russia is a different story. Things happen. And it's a very different game and different player.
We come to Russia.
I'm sorry. Never.
Quanto è importante per l'America la guerra in Ucraina?
The Russian fear that went into Ukraine is the fear of Europe. The Germans, the French all invaded Russia. Okay. And they were survived by distance, strategic depth. They were defeated by that. By the time they got to Moscow, it was winter. And what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union was that the border of Ukraine was 236 miles along Route 30 from Moscow. From the Russian point of view, this was a catastrophe waiting to happen. You would say, nobody's planning to invade Russia. And they'd say, Napoleon himself didn't know he was going to invade Russia. So, now if the Russians take all of Ukraine, they have moved their border to the border of NATO. Because the border of Ukraine is the border of Poland and Slovakia, and the Poland of Hungary, and we will defend them because we will not allow the Russians to dominate the European peninsula. Russian power coupled with the European peninsula, well, that was the Cold War. In other words, if the Russians took all of Ukraine, we would be back in the Cold War. As grateful we are for Italian help always, we may have to do it ourselves. We do not want to stand, as we have a saying in America, you know, that we were standing at the German border. We don't want to stand at the Ukrainian border from Poland and from other places. So they cannot live with the frontier where it is. They cannot live with the enemy potential 236 miles from Moscow. We cannot live with another European war like World War II or an episode like the Cold War. So they don't want and America will lie where it is, and we don't want them where they're coming. And now we'll have a discussion. And that discussion is being held where the Russians discover something about the Americans. We're really very powerful. Simply the weapon of the dollar, the trade currency, when we forced Russia out of the system, hurt them. But we were able to arm the Ukrainians with weapons that devastated the Russian army, and we have not lost any people. So, our people. So the situation is that each side has very reasonable fears of the other. And the question of how this all breaks out is first determined by the military outcome, the essential failure of the Russian invasion. It didn't work. So now there will be a negotiation. It would have been a much more powerful negotiation from the Russian point of view if they had been defeated first. But we will have a negotiation. And it will be settled. And we will spend the next 10 years wondering where the Europeans were. Because one of the great mysteries of America is European foreign policy. But we finally figured it out. Let the Americans do it, and then we'll criticize them. Oh, it's a good way.
Qualche tempo fa tu hai scritto che un cessate il fuoco sarebbe forse possibile in Ucraina basato su alcuni punti. Il primo è il ritiro completo dei russi entro le frontiere del 23 febbraio. Il secondo è la cessazione totale delle forniture di armi americane all'Ucraina, poi la creazione di un fondo alle Nazioni Unite che naturalmente prevede un forte contributo russo per la ricostruzione dell'Ucraina, però quello che non ho capito, se i russi si ritirano e se la situazione è congelata, chi entra nel territorio abbandonato dai russi? Gli ucraini, nessuno, una forza internazionale? Chi può garantire il cessate il fuoco?
Well, this is a problem of all ceasefires. How do you secure it? When I spoke before about the Americans, the Russians not wanting the Americans at their border, well, this is the problem that we face. But the military situation is such that it's clear that the Ukrainian-American alliance has the upper hand militarily. How much longer can the Russians fight? Part of the question is, from a purely military point of view, their ability to supply their troops that far west is stretched. The second issue, of course, is how long do their people tolerate this? We've had in history where the Russian people stood up during World War II and said, enough. So this is one of the questions on China, too. The cost of the Russian adventure is outstripping the benefits. But it's very hard to find a way to get out. And that is really the difficulty. We can find every understanding, but we have to trust each other on terrain, on what is going to be trained. And the Russians don't trust us. We don't trust the Russians. And there really is no party with the weight to negotiate. The Europeans have been in a defensive posture. They've been helping the Americans. The Russians don't trust them at all. So who could come in and guarantee and have the ability to guarantee the borders? Well, we don't really trust the Chinese, but it might be an interesting conversation to have next week. Because the Americans absolutely want this over. This is enough, okay? We do not intend to spend 2 years fighting with the Ukrainians, okay? The Ukrainians also should think it's enough, okay? I know the Poles never think it's enough, but they will just have to leave them out of it. But we want this to end. So we're having a meeting with the Russians next week And that meeting is going to be not about Ukraine, but about the START treaties, the nuclear treaties, which is absolutely what we have to talk about right now. The Russians like to step into negotiations, and they want to be able to say that they are talking to the Americans, but it has nothing to do about Ukraine. Okay, we'll do it. But everything is in flux. Everything is changing, and I suspect this war cannot last another month. And I expect the Chinese and American relationship will be different. We'll be in a different world.
Recentemente il governo americano ha fatto filtrare sui giornali la richiesta al governo di Kiev di essere aperto a negoziati. Insomma, si tratta di una pressione nei confronti dell'Ucraina. Fino a che punto, se tu fossi ucraino, terresti conto di questo? Insomma, fino a che punto l'America è disposta a fare pressioni sull'Ucraina e fino a che punto l'Ucraina deve temere che a un certo punto l'America si dimentichi dell'Ucraina?
Well, the Americans have their own interests, and sometimes it's forgetting, sometimes not forgetting. One of the problems of Europe is it believes that we have a moral responsibility to care, and Ukraine has that feeling. Obviously, that was a terrible accident, that note leaking. No one wanted it to leak, but the message was relieved to the Ukrainians, which has been relieved by General Milan, who is the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's going on in many different ways. When we take a look at the most stable agreement, World War II, it consisted of the United States guaranteeing Germany, its enemy. And it worked because the United States really wanted to block the Russians from reaching the Atlantic. The Russians weren't about to risk anything that crazy. And as a result, the Americans had an interest in Germany that spread out to the rest of Europe. And that really was the foundation of the Cold War. So how do you guarantee that the Americans will cooperate? Well, look at the World War II model. We know what our dangers are, respect our fears, collaborate with us, and then you can count on us. In the case of the Ukrainians, they have this guarantee: we do not want the Russians at the borders of NATO. And if we double-cross the Ukrainians and the Russians come into the fight again, that's a real possibility. So understand the American fears and what they are resolved to do, and you'll see that we are prepared to end the war, have all sorts of concessions to the Russians, except one. They can have maybe part of the eastern area, but they cannot threaten NATO. And if they understand that, then everybody can understand each other. My question still is, who is going to negotiate for the Russians?
Ci avviciniamo alla conclusione. L'America ha una vasta sfera di influenza in Europa che si chiama NATO, che aveva un compito ben preciso ai tempi della Guerra Fredda. Adesso questo compito non appare più così chiaro, ma soprattutto vediamo che la NATO in questa guerra, i paesi della NATO, hanno preso posizioni molto diverse. Una posizione, per esempio, quella della Polonia, che è sempre più, se capisco bene, il vostro favorito in Europa. Un'altra posizione è quella molto ambigua presa dalla Germania. L'Italia non ha preso particolari posizioni, però sta contribuendo all'armamento dell'Ucraina. La Francia continua a mantenere un dialogo con i russi, malgrado gli ucraini abbiano più volte consigliato ai francesi di smetterla. Insomma, ci sono l'Ungheria di fatto aiuta più i russi che gli ucraini. Insomma, ma voi che cosa ci fate ancora con la NATO? Perché vi serve la NATO?
There are wonderful dinners served. It is easier to stay in NATO than to leave it for political reasons and otherwise. But we always find the Europeans take positions. They don't deploy troops. When they deploy troops, it's not many. So in Europe at this point, in our fight with Ukraine, we have Ukraine as an supporter, Poland, the UK, Brits, always our partners. The Germans, after a great negotiation, will send an anti-tank system, which we already have. Europe has got some decisions to make. Every time a war ends, the First World War, Second War, it is the war to end all wars. We're never going to have a war again. We don't have to have a strategic position. Each time, it's not quite right. I remember a couple of years ago when the Europeans were accusing the United States of pulling away from Europe. Okay? So my answer was, and it wasn't welcomed, is, look, Europe is pulling away from the United States. You have an obligation under NATO to have a certain amount of troops there, and you don't put them in. You leave the Americans. Well, it's probably in your interest. You're going to make the assumption that in the event that the Russians ever rolled west, which I don't think they will, the Americans will intervene, and that's probably what will happen. So the Europeans have a cold-blooded approach to foreign policy. First, they know better that it will never happen again. They know it'll happen again. Second, they position themselves so that the Americans have to take the primary burden. Okay. And then they absorb the economic costs to some extent. And we're fighting that war out this way. The Americans have no choice, because if they didn't intervene and the European peninsula became a hostile force, the Atlantic would be endangered. So you have the Americans by the short hairs, which in English means that you're in a fight and you're pulling them and they don't really have an option. Okay? And I understand the rationale that you have there. And I think it's a rational one that I would have dropped. But then I have the problem that I have no idea who I'm talking to when I talk to Europe. The Europeans are so divided among themselves that being able to rely even on that coherent policy, which is, I'm not objecting to it, but will it be there next year? So it's very hard to be an ally of Europe, especially when their accusation is always that we're a bad ally. I think we're pretty good. So the Europeans have mixed interests. The Europeans are never clear on what their obligations are. And the Europeans are very clever in how they get what they want, the Russians not on their border, without paying a price. But that's geopolitics, and that's the way it plays.
Beh, qui emerge chiaramente la differenza fra chi esiste e chi non esiste. L'America esiste, l'Europa no, e questo fa una certa differenza. L'ultima volta, anzi l'unica volta che avete invaso l'Europa lo avete fatto partendo dall'Italia e particolarmente dalla Sicilia. Per la verità più su pressione inglese che per decisione vostra, ma così è stato. Oggi l'Italia è, nell'ambito dell'Alleanza Atlantica, il secondo paese per contingente militare americano, circa 13-14 mila uomini, con molte importanti basi, guarda caso in Sicilia in particolare, ma anche nel nord-est italiano sull'Adriatico. Che cosa ci fate con l'Italia e che cosa volete da noi?
Well, I would first answer by saying I'm not really interested in how many American troops are in Italy, but how many Italian troops are in Italy, which is, I would like to see a force that could be counted on. At the same time, I value Italy's trying to find itself in a very difficult place. The European Union is troubling. The demands of the Germans as opposed to Italy are hard to meet. In the end, the United States has a basic interest in the Mediterranean Ocean. This we see now more than ever, that the Russians have moved into the Black Sea and things of that sort. So what I would like to see is a naval power. That is, you're not going to raise a large army. Fair enough. I understand you. But who controls the Mediterranean, going back to Homer, is a critical matter and is critical to us. We have forces in the Mediterranean, of course. I have a friend who commands one of the task forces, and he'd really like to go home. So it would be very nice to see when we talk about what we have. We'll keep the American troops in Sicily. I don't know who's going to attack you, but we'll hear. But you are a naval power. And as a naval power, you're critical to Europe and critical to the United States. And by spending the money on building that navy, you extract things from the United States, who really values allies, who bring something to the table. So I think Italy should have, how should I put it? It should have a national strategy that combines economic interests of allies and military reality. Whenever we game out the question of a Russian war, which again, I don't expect, okay? The Mediterranean becomes very important, as it was in World War II. And so I would ask you not to measure your contribution by how many Americans are here, but measure your contribution by how well you are protecting your own national interest. And it happens to coincide with the Americans, but it's still what Italy should do.
Uno dei compiti infiniti che noi ci poniamo è quello di discutere sulla nostra strategia nazionale, ma voi ci avete abituato male, nel senso che abbiamo in Italia questo senso comune per cui alla fine tanto decidono gli americani, è inutile avere una propria strategia, che secondo me è sbagliato sia dal punto di vista nostro, lo posso dire io, sia abbastanza inutile dal punto di vista americano. Quindi questa è una lezione, io credo, che noi portiamo con noi in questa discussione, il fatto che noi dobbiamo definire quello che vogliamo e mettere le risorse per realizzare anche quello che vogliamo, naturalmente con gli Stati Uniti, perché questa è la realtà di oggi. Sappiamo che il Mediterraneo è un mare sempre più contestato, che fino a ieri, cioè fino all'inizio della guerra tra Russia e Ucraina, l'America aveva quasi abbandonato, c'era la famosa base di Rota con 4 navi and that's all. Da quando è cominciata la guerra abbiamo avuto la visita di 2 gruppi portaerei americani in Mediterraneo, cosa che non si vedeva da 50 anni, e questo ci conferma quello che tu dicevi, George, che comunque l'interesse dell'America per il Mediterraneo esiste e ha un senso. Quindi è qui che dobbiamo ragionare sul mare, che è la vera caratteristica che ci distingue in Europa. Lo faremo anche, come sapete, domenica, quando verrà a trovarci il capo delle nostre forze armate, l'ammiraglio Cavo Dragone, al quale porrò queste domande. Ma io nel frattempo, a nome di tutti voi, volevo ringraziare George per aver disseminato fra noi conoscenza e dubbi, che è quello che serve per poter ragionare di geopolitica. Abbiamo una collaborazione ormai molto stretta con gli amici di Geopolitical Futures, che continuerà in futuro e sarà ancora più stretta. di questo e di tutto il lavoro che lui e i suoi analisti stanno facendo. Anche a nome vostro ringrazio George e gli auguro un buon viaggio di ritorno.
Thank you.